The battlefield was a wasteland, silent now, but it hadn't been long since the ground shook with the clash of forces. Thick clouds of smoke still hung in the air, swirling lazily as if even they were exhausted from the chaos. Scattered across the dirt were remnants of the fight, shattered armor, broken weapons, and the lifeless bodies of those who had fallen. And in the middle of it all, he stood alone. The Deathworlder, the last man standing. He was still, his breath slow and steady, as his eyes scanned the horizon. Every muscle in his body was ready, his senses heightened, alert to the faintest sound. This wasn't new to him. Being the last one standing, it was a cruel pattern that had defined his life. But today was different. Today, it wasn't just about survival. Today, it was about sending a message. The enemy had underestimated him from the start. They always did. The alien invaders thought their advanced tech, their superior numbers, would make quick work of him. They had no idea. He wasn't like the others they faced. He came from a world where survival wasn't a choice. It was the only way. Everything on his planet had tried to kill him at some point. The wildlife, the weather, even the very air he breathed. He had learned to fight because it was either that or die. And now, here he was, standing on yet another battlefield, facing down yet another enemy who thought they had him figured out. The aliens, with their cold, calculating eyes and weapons humming with lethal energy, believed they had the upper hand. They didn't know what they were up against. They didn't know what it meant to face someone who had been forged in a world designed to break him. A low rumble echoed in the distance. The alien forces were regrouping, preparing for another assault. He could almost hear their arrogance, their belief that they could overwhelm him if they just threw enough at him. But the Deathworlder wasn't worried. They'd learn soon enough. They'd learn what it meant to face a true survivor. His grip tightened on his weapon, a tool that was more a part of him now than anything else. It wasn't about the tech or the gear. It never had been. It was about will, about pushing beyond the limits of what anyone thought possible. And today, just like every other day, he would push those limits again. The battlefield might have been silent for now, but he knew the storm was coming. And when it hit, he would be ready. Long before he became a legend on distant battlefields, the Deathworlder was just a child, born into a world that should have killed him before he could even walk. His planet, if you could even call it that, was more like a nightmare carved from rock and ash, the kind of place where every sunrise felt like a curse, where even the wind cut like a blade. The land was wild, unyielding, and merciless. Most couldn't survive a single day, let alone an entire childhood. But somehow he did. There were no cities, no governments, no order. Only survival. Every day was a fight, not against an enemy with a face, but against the planet itself. The air was thick with toxins, the kind that burned your lungs with every breath, making even the act of breathing feel like a challenge. The creatures that roamed the lands were worse than any predator imagined in nightmares, some massive, others no bigger than a hand, but all equally deadly. He learned quickly that hesitation meant death. There was no room for second-guessing, no time for fear. His earliest memories weren't family or warmth. They were of running, fighting, bleeding, and getting back up. His hands learned to wield weapons before they could properly hold anything else. Every scar told a story, each one earned through blood and pain. He never sought these battles, but in a world like his, they came whether you were ready or not. There was no one to guide him, no one to teach him what it meant to be strong or brave. The planet did that. It forged him in its own way, shaping him through trial after brutal trial. And while others fell, his neighbors, his so-called friends, he kept going. Not because he was stronger, but because he didn't know how to stop. Giving up wasn't an option. And in that relentless struggle, he learned something important. The line between life and death was thin. In fact, it was barely there at all. The key wasn't avoiding death. It was learning how to dance along that line, how to stand on the edge without falling. He didn't just survive, he adapted and evolved. While others saw the danger and crumbled beneath it, he faced it head-on until it became part of him. His world didn't just make him strong. It taught him to think and to outsmart the threats that seemed impossible to overcome. Every predator, every obstacle, was a puzzle waiting to be solved, and he became a master at figuring them out. But the one thing he learned above all was that survival wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about willpower. The will to keep moving, even when your legs screamed at you to stop. The will to fight, even when you were sure you'd already lost. So when the alien forces came, these beings who had never known real hardship, who had only fought on terms they could control, they didn't stand a chance. They had no idea what real fear was, no understanding of what it meant to fight for every single breath. They had their ships, their advanced weapons, their arrogance, and he had his will, the will to outlast them, to make them afraid. Because if there was one thing the Deathworlder knew better than anyone, it was this. In the end, fear was the real weapon. And on this battlefield, just like on the unforgiving surface of his homeworld, fear would be the reason his enemies would fall. Far above the ruined landscape, the alien fleet loomed like a dark omen, their ships casting shadows over the battlefield below. These weren't just any invaders. They were the best, the elite. Warriors bred for conquest, who had carved their way across star systems with ruthless efficiency. They had never known defeat. For them, war was a precise calculation, a game they had mastered, and the prize was always the same: control. Planets, resources, lives. All of it was theirs for the taking. On their homeworlds, they were celebrated as heroes, unstoppable, untouchable. The finest soldiers their empire had to offer. And now they were here, ready to add another world to their growing list of victories. They moved like a machine, each step rehearsed, and each order followed without question. Their armor gleamed, crafted from materials stronger than anything found on Earth, and their weapons hummed with the kind of power that could disintegrate a building in seconds. The commander stood at the front, towering over the others, his eyes cold and calculating. He surveyed the battlefield with a sneer, his confidence unshaken by the sight of his fallen soldiers. To him, the Deathworlder was just a nuisance, a blip in an otherwise flawless operation. One man couldn't stop an entire army, and certainly not someone from a primitive planet like Earth. Their technology was decades, if not centuries ahead. They had numbers, they had firepower, and they had strategy. The commander's voice, low and commanding, cut through the silence, his orders sharp and precise. Sweep the area. Find him. Eliminate him. The soldiers around him moved without hesitation, their movements smooth and efficient. They had done this 1,000 times before, overrun the defenders, crush any resistance, claim victory. The pattern was always the same. Victory was inevitable. But beneath their helmets, behind their cold exteriors, there was something else, a flicker of uncertainty. They had heard stories, whispers, really, about the Deathworlder. Even in the far reaches of space, his reputation had begun to spread. They didn't believe it, of course. No one could be that dangerous. But still, there was something unsettling about the fact that he had taken out the first wave of their soldiers so quickly. How had one man survived that? How had he done so much damage? The commander, though confident, was not blind to the growing tension among his troops. He could sense their unease, the way their eyes darted nervously, as if expecting an attack at any moment. He didn't show it, but even he couldn't deny that this planet, this man, was different. The Deathworlder had turned a battle that should have been over in minutes into a drawn-out confrontation, and that was not supposed to happen. Still, arrogance won out. It always did. The commander waved a hand dismissively, brushing aside his soldiers' concerns. "This human is nothing," he muttered, almost to himself. "We've faced worse." He didn't believe in legends or the power of one man. No, his faith was in his army, in their technology, in the inevitability of their victory. As the second wave prepared to descend, the soldiers adjusted their weapons, their armor clicking into place with a sound that echoed across the quiet battlefield. They were ready, or so they thought. They believed that this would be like all the others, swift, efficient, clean. But deep down, somewhere they wouldn't admit, a seed of doubt had been planted. Because somewhere out there, among the debris and the smoke, the Deathworlder was waiting. And they were about to learn that not everything could be beaten with firepower and precision. Some battles were fought with something far more primal. And when it came to that, the Deathworlder had no equal. The air seemed to hum with anticipation as the alien soldiers advanced, their movements precise, their weapons locked and loaded. They spread out across the battlefield in perfect formation, their cold eyes scanning the horizon for the target. They had been trained to eliminate threats swiftly and without mercy, and that's exactly what they expected to do today. But the Deathworlder didn't give them the chance. He struck from the shadows, moving so fast it was as if the air itself parted to make way for him. One moment, there was nothing, just the empty silence of the battlefield. The next, chaos erupted. The first alien didn't even see him coming. 1 second, the soldier stood tall, his weapon at the ready, and the next, he was on the ground, his weapon shattered, his armor crumpled like tin. The Deathworlder didn't slow down. With a fluid motion, he tore through the second alien, his bare hands moving with the precision and power of someone who had spent his entire life fighting for survival. It wasn't clean, it wasn't flashy. It was raw, brutal efficiency. The aliens, caught off guard by the speed of the attack, scrambled to react. Commands were shouted, their rifles raised, energy blasts cutting through the air. But the Deathworlder was already gone, a blur of motion, moving too fast for their eyes to follow. He dove and weaved through their ranks, using the very debris of the battlefield as his shield. He moved with an instinct honed through years of living on the edge of death. He didn't just dodge the blasts, he anticipated them, knowing where they'd aim before they even fired. A soldier managed to catch a glimpse of him, raising his weapon and firing a blast that would have leveled a building. But it didn't even graze him. The Deathworlder was already on him, his fist slamming into the soldier's chest with enough force to crack the armor. The alien gasped, his weapon slipping from his fingers as the Deathworlder's cold eyes locked onto his. There was no hesitation, no mercy. The soldier crumpled to the ground, and the Deathworlder was gone again, melting into the shadows like a phantom. The remaining aliens, their confidence shaken, regrouped quickly, their commander barking orders, his voice rising above the chaos. Form a perimeter. Don't let him get close. But it was already too late for that. The Deathworlder had broken their lines, and now they were just scrambling to hold on. In the chaos, the Deathworlder's movements were methodical, but there was a ruthlessness to them, a deep primal fury that had been building for years, for every battle he had fought, for every enemy who had underestimated him. He fought with everything he had, every strike calculated to take down his opponents with the least amount of effort. He didn't need fancy weapons or advanced technology. His body was a weapon, honed by the deadly world he had come from. At one point, 2 soldiers managed to corner him, their rifles aimed directly at his chest. But before they could pull the trigger, he was on them, closing the distance in an instant. With a single sweeping motion, he knocked the rifles from their hands and slammed their heads together with a sickening crack. They fell unconscious before they even knew what had hit them. The commander, watching from a distance, felt the first stirrings of fear. He had seen warriors before, even exceptional ones, but this was different. This wasn't just skill, this was something else, something unstoppable. The Deathworlder didn't just fight like a man defending his life. He fought like a force of nature, something wild and untamed, something that couldn't be reasoned with or outmatched. As the Deathworlder ripped through another line of soldiers, the alien commander realized that this wasn't going to be the quick, efficient victory he had expected. The Deathworlder wasn't just winning. He was dismantling them, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left. His soldiers, the best of the best, were falling like leaves in the wind. And still, the Deathworlder showed no signs of stopping. For the first time, the aliens weren't the predators. They were the prey. The remaining soldiers, their numbers dwindling, began to falter, their movements slower, their attacks less coordinated. The fear was palpable now, spreading through their ranks like a disease. They had never faced someone like this before. Someone who seemed more like a beast than a man. Someone who fought with a ferocity that no amount of training could prepare them for. The commander gritted his teeth, his hands clenching into fists as he watched his forces fall apart. He had no choice. He had to call for a retreat or risk losing everything. His pride fought against the decision, but his survival instincts screamed louder. He couldn't let this one man, this Deathworlder, wipe out his entire unit. With a sharp command, he signaled the retreat. His soldiers, battered and broken, were all too eager to comply. They scrambled away, their eyes wide with disbelief, as the Deathworlder stood among the fallen, his chest rising and falling steadily, his gaze locked on the retreating forces. He had won, but there was no joy in his victory, only the cold, hard reality that this battle was just the beginning. The battlefield was silent again, but this time it wasn't the calm before the storm. It was the silence of fear. The once confident alien soldiers who had marched forward with their heads held high and their weapons ready to conquer, now moved with hesitation. Their steps were slower, their eyes darting nervously in every direction, as if the shadows themselves were ready to spring to life and tear them apart. They had never been afraid before. Fear was something lesser beings experienced, not them. But now, it was impossible to ignore. It clung to the air like the thick smoke that still curled from the wreckage around them, wrapping around their thoughts and clouding their judgment. These were the galaxy's most elite warriors, trained, disciplined, undefeated. But none of that training had prepared them for this. They whispered among themselves in their strange guttural language, their voices low and shaky. Words that would have been laughed at before were now filled with weight. Words like monster and unstoppable. They had come expecting an easy victory, but the Deathworlder had shattered that illusion. One by one, they had watched their comrades fall, crushed by a man who moved like a predator, swift and lethal, his strength unlike anything they had ever encountered. The commander, usually so steady, so sure of himself, now found it difficult to mask his own unease. He could feel it too, the creeping doubt, the gnawing uncertainty. He had tried to keep his soldiers in line to maintain control over them, but he could see it in their eyes. They no longer looked at him for orders. They were looking for a way out. He barked another command, sharp and biting, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "Hold the line," he snarled, his voice cracking slightly, though he would never admit it. His soldiers obeyed, but their movements were slow and hesitant. They weren't holding the line. They were clinging to it, barely hanging on. The Deathworlder had done more than just defeat them physically. He had gotten inside their heads. It had shown them something they had never thought possible, that they could lose, that they weren't invincible. The idea was foreign to them, something that went against everything they had been taught. But here it was, staring them in the face, undeniable. And the worst part, they knew he was still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. They could feel his presence, even if they couldn't see him. Every rustle of the wind and every flicker of movement in the corner of their vision set their nerves on edge. Their fingers twitched on the triggers of their weapons, ready to fire at the slightest hint of danger, but none of them believed they'd be fast enough. The commander's hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing. He had never been in a situation like this. His forces had always been superior and always had the advantage. But now he wasn't sure what to do. Retreating felt like an admission of defeat, a failure he couldn't stomach. But staying meant risking everything. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it now. One of the soldiers, eyes wide with panic, stumbled over to him, his voice trembling. We can't win this, sir. He's not human." The commander glared at him, fury bubbling up from deep inside. How dare his soldiers doubt their strength? How dare they suggest that a single man could be more than a match for them? But deep down, the commander knew. The truth gnawed at him, clawing at the edges of his mind. He didn't say it out loud, but he understood now. This wasn't just a man. This wasn't just another fight. The Deathworlder had shown them something primal, something that lay buried deep within their most basic instincts. Fear. The kind of fear that made even the strongest warrior falter, that stripped away the layers of confidence and left only raw, trembling doubt. And that fear was spreading through his ranks like wildfire. The air was thick with tension, the alien warriors standing at the edge of their breaking point. Fear had settled into their bones, weighing down every movement and every breath. Their once unshakable confidence had crumbled. The battlefield that had seemed like their stage for an easy victory was now a graveyard for their fallen comrades, and the Deathworlder was nowhere to be seen. But they knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. And then he struck. It was a blur, faster than any of them could follow, a shadow cutting through their ranks with terrifying precision. The first soldier barely had time to scream before he was ripped from his feet, his body thrown through the air like a rag doll. The others fired wildly, their weapons flashing in the dim light, but they hit nothing. The Deathworlder was already gone, moving through them like a force of nature, unstoppable, untouchable. The commander's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. This wasn't a fight anymore, it was a massacre. His elite soldiers, the best the galaxy had to offer, were falling apart like they had never seen combat before. Panic had taken over, and no amount of orders could bring them back from the brink. The commander knew he was losing control. He watched in horror as the Deathworlder took down one soldier after another, each strike more devastating than the last. The alien armor, once thought to be impenetrable, shattered under the Deathworlder's relentless blows. The energy shields they had relied on were useless. Nothing could stop him. One soldier, desperate to survive, raised his plasma rifle and unleashed a torrent of energy, the blue blasts lighting up the battlefield. For a moment, it seemed like he might succeed, but then, without warning, the Deathworlder was on him. The rifle was wrenched from his hands, twisted, and crushed in a single motion, and before the soldier could react, the Deathworlder's fist crashed into his chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. The remaining soldiers began to fall back, fear gripping their hearts, but the Deathworlder wasn't done. He stepped forward, his eyes burning with a cold, unyielding determination. The ground beneath his feet trembled as he closed the distance, each step deliberate, each movement calculated. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, he was sending a message. Suddenly, the ground rumbled, a deafening roar filling the air as the alien's final weapon, a massive war machine, activated. Towering over the battlefield, its heavy cannon swiveled into position, its metal joints creaking as it prepared to unleash destruction. The commander, desperate and furious, smirked, his pride momentarily restored. "Let's see how you handle this," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. The Deathworlder didn't flinch. The war machine opened fire, a massive energy blast hurtling toward him with enough power to level a city block. The Deathworlder's eyes narrowed, his body moving instinctively. He dodged, the blast grazing the ground just behind him, sending up a plume of dirt and debris. But he wasn't retreating. He was moving forward, his eyes locked on the machine. The alien soldiers watched in disbelief as the Deathworlder sprinted toward the war machine, his body a blur of motion. He moved faster than they thought possible, closing the gap in seconds. The machine fired again, another devastating blast, but he was already gone, leaping to the side and using the wreckage of a fallen ship as cover. And then, with a roar that seemed to shake the heavens, the Deathworlder launched himself at the machine, scaling its side with terrifying ease. His hands gripped the metal like it was nothing, and in moments, he had reached the top. The war machine's cannons swiveled desperately, trying to target him, but it was too late. The Deathworlder was already tearing into the machine's control panel, ripping wires and circuits free with brutal strength. Sparks flew, and the machine groaned under the assault. The alien commander watched, his face pale with shock. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. His ultimate weapon, his unbeatable war machine, was being torn apart by a single man. And then, with one final, powerful strike, the Deathworlder ripped the machine's power core from its housing. The machine shuddered violently, its massive frame collapsing in on itself as it powered down, smoke billowing from the broken joints. The Deathworlder leaked clear just as the machine crashed to the ground with a deafening thud, its once mighty form reduced to a heap of smoldering metal. The silence that followed was absolute. The remaining alien soldiers stared in disbelief, their weapons hanging uselessly at their sides. There was no point in fighting now. They had lost, completely, utterly lost. The Deathworlder stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving with the effort of the battle, but his eyes were calm. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction in the victory. He had done what he needed to do. Nothing more, nothing less. The alien commander, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and fear, gave the order no one ever expected to hear from him. "Retreat," he spat, his voice hoarse. "Fall back. Now." His soldiers didn't hesitate. They scrambled away, retreating toward the dropships that had brought them here, their faces etched with disbelief and terror. They had come to conquer, to claim victory, but now they were fleeing from one man, a man who had proven that no matter the odds, no matter the strength of their forces, he was stronger. As the last of the alien dropships disappeared into the sky, the Deathworlder watched them go, his expression unreadable. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even watch them flee for long. He simply turned his back to the empty battlefield and walked away, leaving behind the shattered remains of an army that would never forget what they had faced here today. The battlefield lay in ruins, a graveyard of metal and blood. The silence that followed the alien retreat was almost deafening, broken only by the faint crackling of fire still burning in the wreckage. The Deathworlder stood alone in the center of it all, his figure a solitary shadow amidst the devastation. He didn't look back at the destruction he had wrought. There was no need to. The battle was over, and the outcome was clear. For a moment, he paused, his chest rising and falling slowly, the weight of the fight still heavy on his muscles. But this was nothing new for him. Victory had never been the goal. Survival was, and once again, he had survived. The alien invaders had come, their weapons shining with the promise of conquest, their hearts full of arrogance. They had believed themselves unbeatable, unstoppable. But now they knew the truth. They had fled in fear, abandoning their dead and their pride, and leaving behind the memory of a fight they would never forget. He had seen their faces, those hardened warriors, now reduced to terrified, trembling creatures. They had come expecting to crush everything in their path, but instead, they had been the ones crushed. The legend of the Deathworlder would spread, no doubt, across galaxies, through the whispers of soldiers and commanders alike. They would tell the tale of the man who had broken their spirits, of the warrior who had turned their fear against them. But for the Deathworlder, this was just another day. His steps were steady as he walked away from the battlefield, his mind already shifting from the fight to the next challenge, the next survival. There was no celebration waiting for him, no cheering crowd or grateful comrades. There was only the long road ahead, the endless fight to survive in a universe that seemed bent on testing him at every turn. As the sun began to set over the wreckage, casting long shadows over the fallen soldiers and broken machines, the Deathworlder disappeared into the horizon. He didn't carry the wake of the battle on his shoulders. He carried the weight of his world, of every fight that had come before and every fight that would come after. The galaxy would remember this day. The invaders, licking their wounds in the far reaches of space, would remember it too. They would speak of it in hushed tones, their voices filled with awe and fear. They would speak of him, the man from the Deathworld. But for him, it was just another fight, another victory, and somewhere out there, in the vastness of space, another enemy would come. Another force would challenge him, thinking they could succeed where others had failed. And when they did, he would be waiting. Because that's what the Deathworlder did, he survived.